The afternoon light filtered through the cracked windows of Maya Johnson's studio apartment, catching dust motes and illuminating her latest artisan pieces, handcrafted jewelry that told stories of resilience and heritage. At 28, she transformed this small space into both home and workshop, despite the building's obvious decay. 3 rejection letters from small business loans sat unopened on her workbench, each one a reminder of the extra hurdles she faced as a Black female entrepreneur in Atlanta's competitive market. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Greg Patterson's knock was more like a demand, 3 sharp raps that made the thin door rattle. "Maintenance inspection," he called out, though Maya couldn't remember the last time any actual maintenance had been performed. She opened the door to find him filling the frame, his landlord's smile not reaching his eyes. "Ms. Johnson," he said, gaze sweeping dismissively over her workspace. "Still running your little craft business?" Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the tension between maintaining professionalism and defending her dignity. "My artisan business is doing well," she replied, emphasizing each word. "Despite the leaking ceiling you still haven't fixed." Greg stepped inside uninvited, his presence seeming to shrink the room. "You know, when I rented to you, I assumed this would be temporary. Most people like you don't stay long." The implications in "people like you" hung heavy in the air. Maya's fingers curled around a piece of rose quartz she'd been wire wrapping, a stone meant for healing and strength. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly but firmly. "My business is growing, and I have every right to be here." Greg's facade cracked slightly. "Rights? Let's talk about rights. Let's talk about late payments last month, about the improvements you made without permission." He gestured to the shelving Maya had installed to display her work. "Improvements that add value to your property," Maya countered. "Unlike the mold in the bathroom that you've ignored for months." The confrontation might have escalated, but Mrs. Clara Williams appeared in the doorway. At 73, the former civil rights activist carried authority in her slight frame. "Everything all right here, Maya?" Greg's demeanor shifted instantly. "Just a routine inspection, Mrs. Williams." "Routine?" Clara's eyebrow arched. "Like the routine repairs we've been requesting for years?" Maya watched the interaction, noting how Greg seemed to shrink under Clara's knowing gaze. This wasn't just about maintenance anymore. It was about power, about who had the right to occupy space and demand respect. Later, Clara stayed for tea, sharing stories from her decades of activism. "He's not used to tenants who stand up for themselves," she observed, "especially not young Black women who refuse to be invisible." Maya fingered the edge of another rejection letter. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting too many battles at once." "Honey," Clara replied, "those battles are all connected. When you fight for your space here, you're fighting for every entrepreneur who got told no because of their skin color, every tenant who got intimidated into silence." The conversation planted seeds of something larger than individual grievance. Maya began noticing patterns, how Greg treated different tenants differently, how maintenance requests from certain residents were mysteriously delayed or ignored. She started documenting everything: dates of requests, photos of repairs needed, recordings of Greg's subtle threats and dismissive comments. Her artist's eye for detail proved useful in building a case of systematic discrimination. What began as a personal stand for dignity was evolving into something bigger. Maya recognized that her struggle with Greg represented a larger pattern of housing discrimination and economic barriers facing Black entrepreneurs. Her studio, despite its flaws, had become more than a workspace. It was becoming a symbol of resistance, a claim to space and legitimacy that Greg and others like him couldn't dismiss. The first meeting happened in Clara's apartment, 5 residents sharing stories over homemade sweet tea. Each tale revealed a pattern: maintenance requests ignored, arbitrary fees imposed, subtle threats about finding more suitable tenants. Maya listened, her artist's notebook filling with details. Sarah, a single mother, described mold problems identical to hers. James, an elderly veteran, hadn't had working heat through last winter. Each story strengthened Maya's resolve. "We're not just fighting a negligent landlord," she realized aloud. "We're fighting a system that assumes we don't deserve better." Clara nodded, sharing documentation she'd kept for years, a historian of their struggle. Greg inherited this building from his father, who made his fortune buying properties in black neighborhoods and letting them decay. The group grew weekly. Maya's artistic skills found new purpose as she created flyers and information packets. Her small studio became headquarters for their organizing efforts, jewelry-making tools sharing space with petition signatures and maintenance logs. Word spread beyond their building. Other tenants in Greg's properties reached out, sharing similar experiences. Local housing advocates offered support and resources, helping them understand their legal rights. Greg's response was predictable but still jarring. Sudden inspections increased. Minor lease violations became threats of eviction. But instead of isolating residents, his pressure united them. Maya found strength in unexpected places. Her jewelry customers became allies, spreading word of their struggle. Some offered legal contacts, others publicity through social media. Her art began reflecting their fight, pieces incorporating broken glass and rusty metal, beauty emerging from neglect. The turning point came during a particularly hostile inspection. Greg entered Maya's studio unannounced, but found himself facing not just her, but a room full of organized tenants. Each held documentation of violations, phones recording his reaction. "This is harassment," he blustered. But his usual intimidation tactics fell flat against their unified front. "No," Maya replied calmly. "This is accountability." Their organization grew more sophisticated. They created a website documenting conditions in Greg's properties. Local news outlets picked up the story, focusing on the contrast between Maya's beautiful artworks and her deteriorating workspace. Clara's experience proved invaluable, teaching younger residents about nonviolent resistance and the power of documentation. "Make them deny your humanity on record," she advised. "Let their own words convict them." Maya's leadership style emerged naturally, artistic, collaborative, focused on amplifying others' voices rather than dominating conversations. She learned to translate individual grievances into collective action, personal pain into political power. Support came from unexpected quarters. Other landlords, concerned about the industry's reputation, pressured Greg to address the issues. City inspectors, armed with their documentation, began formal investigations. The movement they built wasn't just about repairs anymore. It was about dignity, about challenging the assumption that certain people deserved less. Each meeting strengthened their resolve. Each small victory built momentum for larger changes. Greg's attempts to divide them backfired. When he offered Maya a private deal, better conditions in exchange for silence, she brought his offer to the group. Their unified rejection proved their movement couldn't be bought. The city council meeting became their battlefield. Maya, wearing jewelry she'd crafted from building debris, presented their case. Each piece told a story: a necklace made from rusty pipes, earrings incorporating peeling paint chips. "These aren't just accessories," she explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "They're evidence of systematic neglect, transformed into symbols of our resilience." The council chamber was packed with supporters. Clara sat in the front row, her presence a reminder of decades of similar struggles. Greg and his lawyers watched from the back, their confidence visibly shaken by the community's show of force. Maya presented their documentation methodically: years of ignored maintenance requests, discriminatory treatment, retaliatory actions. Each resident's story built upon the last, creating a devastating picture of institutional racism in housing. "We're not asking for luxury," she concluded. "We're demanding basic dignity, the right to live without fear, the right to pursue our dreams in spaces that don't actively harm us." Greg's defense crumbled under scrutiny. His claims of financial hardship contradicted records showing millions in property acquisitions. His denials of discrimination fell apart against their meticulous documentation. The council's decision was unanimous: a full investigation into Greg's properties, heavy fines for code violations, mandatory oversight of future operations. But their victory came with unexpected consequences. Greg's rage turned dangerous. Late one night, Maya found her studio door unlocked, her workspace ransacked. Her art pieces lay broken, a clear message of intimidation. But where he expected to find fear, he discovered strength. The community rallied immediately. Neighbors took shifts watching the building. Local artists donated supplies to replace what was destroyed. Her customers organized a fundraiser that exceeded expectations. The violence of his reaction exposed the truth of their struggle. This wasn't about property maintenance. It was about power, about who had the right to occupy space and demand respect. During the investigation, darker truths emerged. Greg's family's wealth came from decades of predatory housing practices targeting Black communities. His father had actively participated in redlining schemes that shaped Atlanta's segregation. The media coverage shifted from a simple tenant-landlord dispute to a story about historical injustice and contemporary resistance. Maya found herself speaking not just about broken pipes, but about broken systems. Greg's final attempt at control, offering to sell the building at an inflated price, backfired spectacularly. The tenants, working with housing advocates, formed a cooperative to purchase and manage the property themselves. 5 years later, the building stood transformed. The cooperative ownership model they'd pioneered became a case study in community empowerment. Maya's studio, now properly maintained, expanded to include a teaching space where she mentored other artists from marginalized communities. The victory over Greg sparked larger changes. City housing policies were revised, incorporating stronger protections against discriminatory practices. Other tenant groups sought their advice, building similar movements across Atlanta. Clara's apartment became an informal museum of their struggle, displaying photos and artifacts from their fight. New residents learned their building's history as part of moving in, understanding they were joining not just a residence, but a legacy of resistance. Maya's art evolved, incorporating themes of collective power and transformation. Her jewelry line, from ruins to revolution, gained national attention, each piece telling stories of community triumph over oppression. The cooperative model they developed became a blueprint for other communities. They offered workshops on tenant organizing, teaching others how to document abuse, build coalitions, and maintain unity under pressure. Greg's empire eventually crumbled under sustained scrutiny. Other properties he owned formed similar cooperatives, transforming decades of exploitation into experiments in collective ownership. Their story entered local civil rights curriculum, teaching students about contemporary activism and the power of organized resistance. Maya regularly spoke at schools, showing young people how art could serve social justice. The building's transformation went beyond physical repairs. Common spaces hosted community events, job training programs, and youth art classes. What Greg had treated as mere property became a living example of community wealth building. Maya's studio anchored these changes, its walls now gallery space for emerging artists from marginalized communities. Her success helped finance microloans for other Black entrepreneurs, breaking the cycle of loan denial she'd once faced. Clara lived to see all this, her decades of activism finding new expression in their victory. Before passing, she wrote a memoir connecting their struggle to the longer history of civil rights activism in Atlanta. The final irony came when Greg's son, managing his father's remaining properties, sought their advice on ethical property management. Their movement had shifted not just policies, but perspectives across generations. Their building stood as testament to what communities could achieve through unity and persistence. Each maintained apartment, each thriving business, each piece of Maya's art told stories of transformation. From exploitation to empowerment, from isolation to community, from resistance to renaissance.